Good afternoon. On behalf of the Interstate Commission on the Potomac River Basin, or ICPRB, welcome to today's webinar. We're really thrilled that you're here. With funding from ICPRB's EPA Section 106 grant, this is the first event in what we're hoping will become a series of information sharing sessions related to land use in the basin. The staff team that put together this event included Arfine Sharifi, a water resources scientist with ICPRB, Carlington Wallace, a senior environmental scientist, Dee Dee Hunter, senior administrative coordinator, and myself, Heidi Moltz. I'm ICPRB's director of program operations. As a little background, today's event is part of the implementation of the Potomac Basin Comprehensive Water Resources Plan. After an extensive stakeholder development process, the ICPRB commissioners adopted the plan in 2018. And since that time, staff have been working hard to implement the recommendations for action contained in that plan. If you haven't already, I encourage you to explore the plan's contents and engage with the plan's adaptive implementation. Arfine is going to place the link to the plan's webpage in the questions box, so you'll have that webpage for later browsing. Following up on the recommendations of the plan's land use challenge area, we published a manuscript in the journal Water in 2020 called Integrating Sustainable Water Resources Management and Land Use Decision Making. And it outlined a path for information sharing among land use decision makers in the basin through a brown bag lunch type webinar series. The link to that article is also going to be placed in the questions box. And we heard loud and clear during the Comprehensive Plan virtual event series last year that information sharing sessions would be helpful for land use decision makers in the basin, especially if those events provide practical tools where folks can log in and learn about resources that are readily available and of direct use and applicability to their daily jobs. So that's what we're planning on starting to do here today. And now we're so pleased to have Renee Thompson with us today. Renee is a geographer with the USGS and the coordinator of the Chesapeake Bay program's Maintain Healthy Watersheds goal implementation team. And Renee is going to discuss and demonstrate the Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds assessment during our hour together this afternoon. So the link for the tool is going to be placed in the questions box for your reference during and after today's session. Renee is going to spend about 30 minutes demonstrating the tool's applications, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session, and then a few minutes of closing by Arfine Sharifi of the ICPRB staff. So as a reminder during today's event, please put all your questions in that question box. Carlington Wallace is going to be monitoring that questions box throughout the event, and he's going to let Renee know if any clarifying type questions arise during her presentation. And then otherwise, he's going to pose your questions from that questions box to Renee during the Q&A period. So we really hope to get to all your questions during today's event, but if that's not possible because of time limitations, we can follow up with answers afterwards, and Renee's contact information will be available, so you can also reach out directly to her. So thank you again for joining us today, and with that, I'll turn it over to Renee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to confirm that you can see my full screen and not my presenter view.
We're seeing the presenter cue.
It skips back and forth. Let's see if we can switch that real quick. There we go. And now?
Perfect.
Great, thank you. Just going to minimize myself here. So good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. I have the pleasure of talking about something that I'm very passionate about and has been a project at the Bay program with partners across our USGS agency, but also folks within our land data team and GIS team at the Bay program, with countless scientists providing input to this project, and Tetra Tech, led by Nancy Roth, has been instrumental in the creation of this as well. So even though I'm presenting today, it's been a small army in the making. We're really hoping that this information can serve as a decision support tool for multiple uses, and I'll demonstrate some of those for you today. So today I'm going to be giving you just a brief overview for anyone who's not familiar with the Chesapeake Bay program and the Chesapeake Watershed Agreement, in order to make sure we all start out on the same page. We have a great infographic just briefly going over sort of how the agreement outcomes and where the Healthy Watershed sort of assessment fits into that. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about local engagement and communication resources here at the Bay program. And then we're going to get into the good stuff, which is the background of the Healthy Watersheds Assessment, as well as providing you a basic demo in terms of just what's in there and how to navigate around, as well as provide you a couple of examples of specific management applications. I am going to make an attempt to provide links as we go, as I'm demonstrating things. So if any of you are brave and wanted to try to follow along, you would be welcome to do that. It's my understanding that this webinar will be recorded, so it might be good to just sit and listen, and then you could come back and take your own hand at it on a second view. And then finally, we've got some other wonderful decision support resources, and then of course the Q&A that was mentioned. So just to set our stage a little bit, the Chesapeake Watershed Agreement was formally signed by the governors of the 7 jurisdictions across the 64,000 square mile watershed. And this was in 2024. And essentially, this is what the Chesapeake Bay program management structure looks like. So you have the executive council. You can think of those folks as the people who signed and made this agreement. We have an overall principal staff committee. You can think of that a little bit like our kind of board, our overseeing board. Then we have a sort of more of a day-to-day management board with some great, all the leaders of our goal teams, and they really help in terms of setting the course for the future of the Bay program, as well as being an amazing resource for problem solving and gap filling. We have several advisory committees focused on various topics. We have a communication team. We also have a team called STAR, which is really supporting of our goal implementation teams to provide that science support and coordination that we need. And then finally, we have 6 goal teams focusing on these different things. And the goal teams are sort of the outcomes related to the agreement are nested in these goal teams. So you'll see us here. I'm the coordinator of the Maintain Healthy Watersheds goal team. So moving right along. This is a wonderful graphic. I'm just going to pop out online to show you real quick. And I will pop this into the chat. Irvani, if you could just forward this to the panelists or to the rest of the group. So this is basically that same graphic that I just showed you with all of the goal implementation teams on the left and all of the outcomes of the Bay Agreement on the right. John Wolf, my supervisor at USGS, who is amazing at infographic development and just communication in general, created this. But the one thing that I really like about this is that you can kind of map your path here. So here at the Healthy Watersheds, we're focused on the Healthy Watersheds outcome. But in addition to that, we also are focused on something called the Land Use Options Evaluation outcome. And this is really about how land use affects watershed health and sustainability, and also looking at policies, incentives, and planning tools that might be helpful in reducing the rate of change or of natural to impervious surface. And it was decided early on that land use change is really one of the biggest factors affecting healthy watersheds. So we've basically adopted these two outcomes here. The land use method metrics is complementary to the land use options evaluation, where our land data team at the Bay program, led by Peter Claggett, one of my colleagues at USGS, is working to really track the rate of farmland, forest, and wetland change throughout the watershed. And we have some great high resolution data at the 1 meter scale. It's some of the best data that is actually available in the country. And so we're beginning to be able to look at how our anthropogenic influences might be affecting our natural resources. So this is really my bailiwick here, these 3 outcomes, but I encourage you to explore that on your own. So you guys are going to get dizzy with all of my jumping back and forth today, but hopefully this will make sense to you. So our goal is this: sustain state identified healthy watersheds, 100% of them. We want to keep them that way. It's a lofty goal. So what are healthy watersheds? Well, EPA defines them as dynamic, hydrologic, that have geomorphic processes that are within a natural range. They haven't been, say, maybe channelized, things like that. They have really great sufficient habitat that supports aquatic and riparian species, as well as all of those great bugs and critters that we need within our integrity of biological indexes to track. So, and good water quality as well. So this is how EPA defines it. Our state identified healthy watersheds are a little bit different in that it's a cooperative voluntary program, and the states have each all had their own ways of defining watershed health. So the challenge for us is to apply some sort of way to track and understand the spectrum of health and vulnerability across the region when we have different standards of watershed health across the various jurisdictions. So I mentioned this land use option evaluation, and I think the important thing is that we're really trying to figure out the yin and yang of providing data and information, but also providing information about management actions that can actually help curb any potential vulnerability associated with land use change. So these kind of set the stage for where we're at. This is just, I think, a great map. It's an example of some of the ways in which we work to visualize rates of change across the watershed. You can see the map on the left is looking at sort of areas with high development pressure between now and 2050, and this is based on basically past rates of change, as well as zoning and expectations that counties have provided. And then we can also sort of look at the distribution of commercial, residential, and mixed use. So this is just an example of some of the information. The trick for us, obviously, is how do you package all of this resources and data to inform decision-making for folks like you? It's one thing for us to kind of work in our black boxes in our offices at the Bay program and make reports and do studies and make great maps and provide great metrics related to change. But if no one's using this information or aware of it, then it isn't much good. So this is a framework that we've sort of set up for working to not only engage locals, but communicate with them. And I think, you know, some of us think of ourselves over here and the subject matter experts, but you know, how do we translate that to things that are meaningful to those who are working on the ground to make decisions, and also at a level that they might understand. Perhaps they don't have a PhD in geomorphology, for example. And we really want to provide this information through trusted sources where people get their existing information. And then obviously the audience is the final step. So this just gives you an idea of, how we're trying to think about getting this information out there. So an example might be something, let me just move the screen here so I can see my notes. So this might be an example. Let's say we have new data and tools like the high resolution land use and land cover data that I just mentioned. So we want people to use these tools to inform county comprehensive plans or MS4 permits, or perhaps local advocacy for land protection or tree canopy. And so taking that framework that I just showed on the previous slide, we have different audiences depending upon what that information might be. And here's some examples of that, the trusted sources where they might get that sort of information. And who should be doing the translating? Who should be taking that information that is provided by the subject matter experts and the goal teams and scientists who are working across the region? We need help with sort of science communicators and experts in graphic development and fact sheets and other information that we can kind of feed this through to make sure that it's getting to the right folks. So these are sort of new ideas that we're having at the Bay program. We're struggling with, how we can provide resources that are useful to folks on the ground in a format that they find valuable. And so if you have thoughts on this, we would be very happy to hear them, I think is the summary message there. So let's think a little bit about the Healthy Watersheds Assessment. So we have this data not only at the state identified scale, which I'll show you in a moment, but also the entire watershed. And so I'm gonna back out and show you one more amazing infographic. And that is, this was developed by our staffer, Nora Jackson, she's at the Chesapeake Research Consortium, and staffs our goal team, as well as works with forestry folks and federal facilities folks. And it turns out she's a great science communicator too. So the Healthy Watershed Assessment can be thought of in parts or as an entire index, depending upon what your sort of end use and interest might be. So we've categorized these into overall sub-indices in these various categories. And through them, you can actually see the specific metrics that are associated with them, at what scale the catchments were aggregated. You can look at the individual metrics or the sub-indices. We've got all kinds of things related to land cover, road density. We've got biological information, a lot of information related to natural land cover, as well as stream impairments and pollution loading. So I'm just going to drop this in case you wanted to learn a little bit more about that one. And then the second thing that we look at is vulnerability. And unlike the Healthy Watershed Index, we actually don't tend to roll this up into its sub-indices. And the reason for that is that oftentimes stressors and vulnerabilities are going to have very different management applications depending upon what that stressor might be. So in land use change, for example, we've got metrics related to forest loss, increase in development, that blue map I showed you earlier, as well as the percent of land conservation from our Chesapeake Bay protected lands data set, which I also happen to maintain as one of my other hats at the Bay program. So we can look at water use, domestic water use, industrial, and ag. We've got a few climate change metrics in there, which I'll demonstrate shortly, as well as understanding wildfire risk, which isn't as much of a concern in this region, but it could be a growing concern with climate change implications. So jumping back to our presentation, This is just a little background on, kind of what we're hoping this will be for folks. We really want to support the BAY program and the jurisdiction partners. That's what our driving force is. We want to understand, what are those signals of change? What are those thresholds of, impervious surface that might be negative for fish populations, or how much riparian forest buffer do we need to maintain a healthy watershed? Information like that. Also just supporting strategies. Let's say you're a land trust and you're applying for a grant, perhaps providing these sort of mapping resources and metrics might be useful in order to make the case. Also providing an early warning. Where are areas that are really perhaps very healthy that have specific threats or stressors that they're facing. And then of course as a communication and management tool as well. And I'll show you a fact sheet that we have for that. So again, a wonderful graphic developed by Nora. And this is just some ideas to kind of get your juices flowing about how the Healthy Watershed Assessment could be applied in your jurisdiction or within your organization. So now the fun part, yay. Okay, so when you get to the Healthy Watersheds Assessment, which we already provided a link to you for that one, you'll hit this landing page, and this is just kind of gives you a good background. It talks about sort of the EPA preliminary Healthy Watersheds Assessment. It gives you some helpful links to the original report if you really want to dig into how the heck did we do this. This 200-page report with appendices is available to you for review. There's a lot of great information within our Chesapeake Open Data portal, and in addition to that, you can actually download this entire geodatabase from there and use that within your own web mapping or or desktop-based mapping applications if you happen to be GIS savvy yourself. So this, I usually like to just hit OK instead of don't show, because that way, in case there's something in there I need, I can see. So I'm just going to kind of zoom out a little bit so we can figure out where the heck we're at here. So obviously we're focused on the Potomac River Basin here today, and I'll zoom into that in a moment. But I just wanted to kind of start out with a little bit of an overview of what is in here. So a great place to start is obviously the quick start information, and the little I here down at the bottom can help you find that. This is just an overview of what sort of each of these buttons are at the bottom. You can search for layers. You can use these little buttons to the right to provide a few different options depending upon how you want to view things. You can set visibility range, so perhaps you just want to see a metric once you zoom in very close to it. You can not only show the layer list here, but it's sort of a cleaner way to show the legend and understand sort of the meaning of the colors that you might be seeing. There's a great function to actually add data, which I'll demonstrate in a moment, that if you have a shapefile on your desktop that you want to upload into there, or if you have a web link to a Maryland IMAP data set that you would like to overlay, you can do that. You can also change your base map so that it looks, whoops, you can, make it darker or add some labels in there so you can better acquaint yourself of where you are. So there's some great information that way. So just familiarizing you all with the layer list here. And this could be, if anyone was following along, this could be a good place to start. Maybe you could do a side-by-side view here, but you'll start with just extending the Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds. It'll kind of look like this. So you just press this little button here and expand it. And we've got several reference layers here. We start out with just the watershed boundary on, but you can also turn your state boundaries on, or, figure out where the shoreline is. We can look at just the healthy watershed boundaries, which you can see are consistent with what's turned on right now. or a very busy all catchments in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I didn't mention this earlier, but all of these metrics are summarized at a catchment scale. And the reason for that is we're trying to make it as relevant for local planning as possible. But it is necessary to use a little bit of caution with that, and that sometimes metrics have to be transformed quite a bit in order to be summarized in that way. And so we always suggest to use a little bit of caution when you're looking at a very small scale. So essentially, this is broken up into two different sections. You have the state identified healthy watersheds, and all of the associated, the overall metrics, the health sub-indices. So those graphics that I was showing you earlier back here are organized in the exact same way. So we've got our landscape metrics, our hydrology metrics, and so on. And you can look at those individually, or if you thought, gosh, I just want to look at landscape. And so you might just turn on the sub-indices. So this would be an example of landscape conditions. So you can see there are some areas within the Potomac watershed, healthy watersheds that are considered, very healthy in terms, or that are considered very high in terms of their really natural landscape. And so what I'm going to do is actually pull us out of the state identified healthy watersheds, and we're going to look at the all catchments here so that we can better get a sense of what's going on in our Potomac River Basin. So this is an example of the overall watershed health index. So you could think of this as we've rolled everything up into one index, and we want to look at all of these metrics sort of collectively. That's what you're seeing here in this map. And similarly, you have all of your health sub-indices. So this time, perhaps we want to look at biological condition. Or you can come down here to your vulnerability metrics and look at land use change and perhaps percent protected land. So one thing to keep in mind is obviously there's a lot of layers in here, right? So I keep track myself by really paying attention to what the host sort of layer is. So you've got your reference layers. That has to be turned on in order to see anything below it, right? So if I turn this reference layer off, I can't see the watershed boundary or the state boundary anymore because these are sub-layers of that. And so just a little tip to acclimate yourself within here. If you turn something on and you can't figure out why you're not seeing it, it's probably because you don't have the upper layer kind of group layer turned on. And so similarly, I came down here to our protected lands, and you can turn your legend on to get a sense of, what do these numbers represent. So a very dark green would be somewhere between 80 and 100% of that catchment is protected. And when you start zooming in real close like this, that could be a good time for you to turn your all catchment boundaries on so that you can get a sense of where certain catchments are ending or beginning. Generally, if I'm really zoomed out, I don't keep them on because they just make everything messy. But that is, when you are zooming in, just a reminder, that's a great place to go ahead and turn that on. So now that I've given you a little bit of a just kind of overview of how to navigate within the layers, I want to take a little bit of time to show you some of the tools that we can do. So as I mentioned earlier, just a moment. Thank you so much. Working mom here. You can make a dark gray base map. You can add, you know, something more classic. I like light gray just because things pop a little bit that way. You can also set a bookmark. So you can see in here that I've been doing some work in some different areas. And so I've already zoomed in. I've already sort of had a couple bookmarks of areas that I could work in. But essentially, if you find yourself, you know, working in your Potomac watershed, as I find your Potomac watershed again, you know, you might be really interested in, you know, this area in Hamilton because that's where your land trust works. And so you could just click the add bookmark button right here, and you can name it something like Hamilton. And that way, when you want to come back, this map actually remembers you, even though it's all the same website. When you come back with the same browser and the same computer, it remembers your bookmarks. I don't know how, it's magic. And so you can also filter things. And so you can see as soon as I press filter, this was like, oh no, there's something wrong. A really important thing to remember about filtering data is that you have to have this master layer turned on. So this is sort of the overall index score for everything. And the reason that you have to have this on is because this data set in the background actually contains every single metric in it. And so essentially, even though we're displaying this as the overall health index score, in the background, you can filter it however you like. So now that we have that layer turned on, we can try filtering again. And oh my goodness, I think Andy broke my filter. So this is, you know, this is the danger of live web viewing sometimes. So we'll go back to that one. So there's a few different ways that you can also understand the nature of the data that you're looking at. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on what looks to be a healthy watershed here and zoom in a little bit more. You need to make sure it's actually highlighted. And you can see there that within this area, I clicked a few things, and so there's a little arrow here, like let's say there's a little arrow here where you can see the various layers that you might happen to have turned on and their metrics associated with it. So when you have something selected like this, you can look at the data in this way, which is all of the metrics associated with it. Or we have this little widget here called the Watershed Catchment Report. We ran some updates last night, which may have been a bad time to do so. I'm just going to reload one time and make sure we don't have a little glitch here. There we go, kind of. No, it's still broken. Okay, so the Watershed Catchment Report, as soon as it is fixed, which it will be fixed very soon, I assure you, provides you with map tips. So you can essentially expand each of these metrics, and it shows you a little bit more detail related to each of the metrics. So it's not only what the metric is, but it also tells you where it came from. So for example, this forest in riparian cover, when you expand that in this section, you will see that the forest and riparian cover comes from high resolution land use data that was made by the Bay Program in 2013. And similarly, if you looked at something like housing data, you would see that this data came from the census at the block group scale for 2020. And so when we get this fixed and back and running, you'll be able to take a look at that. But for some reason, it's not fixed. So, whoops. I'm going to pop us back out to our presentation so we can kind of pick up a little bit where we left off now that we've done an overview of the watershed health assessment. Let's talk a little bit more about other applications. So one of the first things that we started to look at was really trying to figure out how watershed health, and I'm going to start talking a little more quickly because I'm getting through this, but I don't want to cut into our conversation time. But the climate work group at the Bay Program came up with this this framework for potentially looking at indicators related to climate resilience. So on the top is this framework where they're looking for physical indicators, and that's what we would at the watershed think of sort of our signals of change. And then they're looking at the impact indicators. So what physical indicators are having an impact, in this case on brook trout? And then how can we understand resilience or preparedness? So within the Healthy Watershed Assessment, we do have a change in stream temperature. We have a current brook trout, as well as a likelihood of brook trout with an increase in 6-degree temperature. And so with that information, we might be able to begin to get an assessment of where we may want to focus on increasing climate resilient habitat. So from a conservation perspective, we might be very interested in where brook trout are currently, where they will be in the future, and whether or not that habitat is protected. If that habitat isn't protected, then that might be a targeting. You also might want to look at that in concert with other vulnerability, like looking at intact habitat that is climate resilient for brook trout that also might have a stressor related to development impact. And so that could further help you hone where you go with that. And so moving back out to the Healthy Watershed Assessment, I'm going to demonstrate for you how you might go about doing something like that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off our overall index score and turn off our state ones for now too. And we're going to go down here to our vulnerability metrics and our climate change metrics. So you'll notice when I clicked brook trout occurrence, nothing happened. Is there another menu? Oh, there it is. So if it doesn't turn on, that's a great trick for you. So this is sort of where we feel, not where we feel, but where brook trout is currently known to be from. So again, I'm just sort of bringing us back to the Potomac a little bit. And then we also have this, where are they likely to be if stream temperature increases 6 degrees? So with that, we can see that we obviously are finding that there's likely to be a loss of brook trout habitat moving into the future as we have an increase. However, we also can see that there are some areas through here, for example, that seem to be potentially more resistant to those impacts. In this particular location, educated guess would be this has something to do with elevation, but it's worth sort of zooming in and taking a look at sort of what are the characteristics of these watersheds that might be more prone to supporting brook trout habitat. And so we can see here If we turn back on our Watershed Health Index overall score, we can begin to see, sorry, got a little lost there. There we go. I'm going to zoom way in so I don't get lost here. So this is my guy. Okay, so in this relatively sustaining brook trout habitat area, we've got a lot of forest in here. We have a lot of forest in the riparian zone. We have very low population density, very low forest loss, very high in our landscape condition, but the highest value is 1. So but some impervious in our riparian zone. Great natural connectivity according to the Nature's Network. So you can kind of go down here and eventually, get a sense of what some of these characteristics are. Now, if we wanted to start looking at vulnerability, then we might be interested in increase in development, for example. So within this area that we're looking at, we can see that there's a relatively low risk of development. There's sort of this area here around Moorfield that doesn't really support a lot of brook trout to begin with, that is experiencing an increase in development, but generally it's pretty low, which likely means that this area is not protected. See, I would have guessed that this area was protected given how healthy it is or how healthy it seems to be. But what we can see is this area north of it is protected. So you can see how I'm just using the metrics to kind of hone in and understand regions and what might be going on in surrounding areas to use as a way to help me understand what might be happening to populations in my area, but also where I might want to target restoration or conservation activities based on what my organization's priorities might be. So what I'm going to do is turn our protected lands on. And we'll come over to this area here that looks pretty well protected and has a little bit of brook trout in this area. So you can see what I'm trying to do here is find an area in the Potomac watershed that is highly protected and is at risk of development. And so unfortunately with the danger of live demos, you would normally be able to use our filter tool to go ahead and select thresholds that you would be interested in. So in this example, you might want to identify all areas that have an increase in development greater than 40, all areas that are protected that potentially are less than 40, and potentially all brook trout that are maybe higher than 60. So that combination of things would start to tell you where you have good chance of resilient brook trout habitat, what level of protection it has. In this example, I said it's not as protected, and where it might have a high potential for development pressure. And so through that, you can begin to hone in on where healthy brook trout might be that is in danger of conversion without proper protections put in. So I won't belabor that point, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how one might go about using this type of information. And so I got ahead of myself a little bit here, and that I meant to kind of show you this, this slide first. And so what I just demoed for you was protected areas threatened by development pressure. And we added the brook trout in there as well. And so this is probably especially useful for people who are working in kind of fringe suburban, ex-urban areas, which is generally where development pressure tends to be the highest. So there's one example of a potential use for you. Okay, I'm gonna fly through these last two slides because I want to make sure that we have time for Q&A. These are some amazing resources for you, and I'll make sure that they are in our follow-up email to you. But essentially, these are kind of what I consider to be our heavy hitters in terms of decision support resources, especially for living resource-related resources. John Wolf, again, my supervisor, has been working really hard on this this beta version of our environmental equity, our environmental justice and equity dashboard, and it provides access to a variety of spatial data layers that are pertinent to addressing environmental issues. And this can be in areas that have underrepresented populations like communities of color or low income or potentially linguistically isolated communities. Most of this information comes from the census data and also EPA's EJ screen. And those are sort of the key data sets that we're starting to use to also start taking some of these considerations into our restoration and conservation activities. And then finally, I just want to draw your attention to our open data portal. Which is right here. And this is where you can find things like the Chesapeake Healthy Watersheds data and map. So I somehow just downloaded it right there. So that's as easy as it is to download that information. This is our watershed data dashboard. I just want to give you a quick overview of this land policy and conservation. This is where you can start to get at some of the information related to the high resolution land cover and how you can use that in your decision making, as well as additional resources related to management applications. I'm going to stop there. You can see I'm very excited about this information. And I'm going to stop. Actually, I'll just leave my screen up for now in case anyone had specific questions about anything that I covered. So there we go. I'm not sure if we have a moderator for this section or not.
Renee,
Yes.
we do have a question from Mr. Chuck Boyd.
Okay.
Mr. Boyd is asking, have you thought how you would step a local government through the use of the assessment tool to help the update the comprehensive plan's sensitive areas element? In other words, do you have policy guidance when you look at a specific metric for your community and the score is high or low? What does the score mean? And do you have recommended policy actions to address this score?
So I think what you're getting at, sir, is really tying the data with the way in which we would curb or address it on the ground. And I think we're starting to get there with that last piece that I showed you, which is really looking at this this watershed data dashboard. And so we have quite a few resources that would provide you information about how one might go about implementing a specific policy option as a result of a stressor that you're taking. So one example is this great module that was just developed by Greenfin here at the Bay program. And just drop this in because I think it's very relevant to you folks as an audience here. But essentially going through this, it gives you a sense of how you might think about preserving your local character based on specific stressors. And it goes through specific targeted actions. So understand, let's see here. So different tools. So if you're working through comprehensive planning, what are some examples that other regions have used? What are specific zoning ordinances or impact fees or taxes? So it sort of depends, I think, on what the stressor is and what a local government is trying to accomplish as to how they would use the tools. And in terms of the thresholds that you mentioned, I don't know if they're so much based on policy as they're based on science. So, for example, anything over 2% impervious is actually found to have a negative impact on brook trout. However, anything above 10% impervious is sort of more of a general kind of watershed degradation number that has become to be accepted. And so the trick is, I think, is reaching out to folks like myself and other folks if you need help understanding what tools might be available to address your needs in your local jurisdiction. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that kind of answered your question.
Chuck, if you'd like to comment, you have capability to do so. Okay, let's go on to the next question.
You covered what I was asking for.
Okay.
I'm from the Maryland Department of Planning, and again, we tried to develop tools for local governments, and again, I think this tool is an excellent bridge, and we'll just need to work with locals to try to develop policy guides for them at the local level. Thank you.
Well, that's great. And just so that you know, Jason Dubois is actually our vice chair of the Healthy Watershed Goal team. And I think that it's a great opportunity and low-hanging fruit potentially to work with MDP a little bit on how we might mock this up and obviously then be able to apply it to other locales as well. So thank you for your comment.
Renee, we have another question, more of a comment really from
Sure.
Mr. Frank Rogers. Frank, would you like to chime in on your comment?
Hi, sorry, I apologize. You were looking for protections in West Virginia, and I apologize that we don't have many. I was suggesting you might look a little north in Western Maryland. You might find some around. Of course, we have the George Washington Jefferson National Forest and the Monongahela, but they're not threatened by development. So,
right.
Sorry for the unlucky hunt in West Virginia.
Okay, thank you. Renee, we just have one more question.
Sure.
The question reads, Virginia is concentrating on cattle exclusion stream fencing buffers to meet Bay goals. A potentially much better solution for P reduction would be buffers on corn land dependent in width on gradient of field segment. Harvest of cover crop on buffer would facilitate removal of P and provide economic benefit to offset costs. Now, this is from Bernard. Bernard, would you like to comment more on your question?
Well, I mean, while Bernard is maybe figuring out unmuting or you know, I think in an application like that, I would recommend using the add data tool. So you would sort of take in your delineations of the areas that you are wanting to target those BMPs, and then depending upon what your priorities are, you might use different metrics within the watershed health assessment to prioritize where you want to put those resources. So that's sort of the best example I can think of how you might be able to apply it at that scale. But when you're really zooming into a stream segment scale, you know, that's sort of the caution that I was providing earlier, that you know, while we have high resolution land use land cover at a 1 meter scale, all of this data is aggregated at a catchment scale. And so if you try to go more fine than that to a parcel level, things will be very generalized.
Okay, Renee, thank you. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so I'm going to call the 5-minute rule at this point. Renee, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, we're about to close soon, so Heidi or Irfane, any closing remarks before we end the webinar?
Hi everyone, I'm Irfane Sharifi, one of the ICPRB staff team behind this webinar event. Today we learned about the Chesapeake Healthy Watershed Assessment online tool that was developed by the Chesapeake Bay Program's Maintain Healthy Watershed Goal Implementation team. On behalf of the ICPRB staff, I would like to thank you for being here today and for taking the time to answer the pre-meeting questions. I also would like to thank Renee Thompson for demonstrating this great tool, Chesapeake Healthy Watershed Assessment Tool, and for her cooperation with ICPRB staff. Thank you very much, Renee. As Heidi Moltz mentioned at the beginning, today's webinar was the first event of a series for sharing practical, ready-to-use tools and techniques to promote sustainable land and water resources management in the Potomac Basin. So we would like to have your ideas about the topic of the next webinar and the speaker. Please take a moment and write your ideas about the topic and the speaker for the next webinar in the chat box now before leaving the webinar. We are going to send follow-up questions to you after today's webinar. You can provide your feedback about this event and the Chesapeake Healthy Assessment using the follow-up questions. You can also share your ideas for the topic and the speaker of the next webinar using the follow-up questions. Thank you again, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.
I don't know if it's too late or funny. I was able to load my watershed catchment report in Chrome. So that's a little tip for folks. It seems to be working better in Chrome. If anyone wanted to stay just like 2 more minutes, I could demonstrate that additional functionality that I wasn't able to, but it's up to you all.
Are you able to send the link to me? Then I can share it with the audience as well. Is there a link for that?
No, it's part of the assessment tool, that little button, the watershed catchment report. So I really encourage people to go back and play with that a little bit, because there's a lot of functionality in there. And make sure you hit the generate report button so that you can get a nice little fact sheet on what that looks like. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, everyone, thank you for your participation.